Hi, and welcome. My name is Morgan Lee. So today we're talking about the impact of language deprivation and educational approaches that you can use in the classroom. So a little bit about myself. I am a native of Virginia. I received my master's degree from Boston University in deaf education. I also have a graduate certificate from Gallaudet University for teaching deaf students with additional disabilities. And I'm currently in an EDD program at American University for Education, Leadership, and Policy. This is my 13th year of teaching. I've taught in public school, private separate school, and private school. I'm very interested in language deprivation. I think it's an area that we don't look at often enough, but that we're seeing impacting our classrooms more and more each year. So let's begin. So as we begin the presentation, I think it's important to recognize the positionality of the speaker because our intersectional perspectives really do shape who we are. And that comes from both the inside and exposure to things from the outside. So the image that is seen on this slide, this is adapted from the Wheel of Power and Privilege. So some identities are closer to power, while other identities, as you move further from the center of circle, these are identities that have less power, which are called marginalized. So my positionality, I'm a white hearing teacher of the deaf. I'm queer and non-binary. And I also think it's important to say that I'm coming into this presentation as a person who does not have their own children. So for you, as you begin to engage with this presentation, I think it's also important to consider your own positionality, what identities you hold that are close to power and those which are marginalized. And then we have to think, why is it important to recognize your own positionality? And as you think about that, for me, what comes up immediately is that often I do not share the positionality of my students. Many of my students currently and in the past, in different settings that I've taught in, tend to have very different positionalities than I have. And this means their family background, the language they use, where they may be from, the education of their family. And something else we know about positionality is that when we recognize who we are, it can help us to shift deficit mindsets that we might have established toward other positionalities. In this quote on the page, it says that by challenging these positionalities, we can move from a deficit mindset against deaf and instead see an individual being deaf as their own personal gain. But this could be applied to other positionalities as well. It's not limited only to what on this wheel is ability and disability, but it can apply to all of these different categories. So some goals for this presentation, I won't read through them, but here they are. And interaction is the best way to learn. So as you're watching this, I encourage you to talk to your colleagues about the things that you might see that interest you, things that bother you. And, sometimes when you see a presentation and something strikes you as odd or not fitting with the way that you have thought of things traditionally, that's a really good time to start thinking why, and a good time to chat with those that you work with. So the table of contents for today, it's quite packed. So let's go. The first section is language deprivation. So like I mentioned, I've worked in a number of different settings in 13 years. And I know that many of you have also worked in many settings, and many of you have probably worked more years than I have. So my experience, when I graduated from my graduate program, I immediately got a job working with deaf children with additional disabilities, which interestingly enough, and maybe it's the same for you, that was not something that I was taught in my graduate program. So it was quite a adjustment, quite a learning experience. And then when I left there, I went to work at a residential deaf school teaching high school. And that's where I first noticed that the classes that I were teaching, many of the students had language deprivation. So they would be 17, 18, 19, 20, 21 years old and reading first, second, third grade levels. So that was my first introduction to it, which also I was not taught in my graduate program. So as my career has continued, I keep noticing similar patterns. And my guess is that if you're watching this, you have also noticed certain patterns. So to look at some basic statistics, we're all pretty familiar with this. 95% of deaf children are born to hearing parents. Only 5% are born to deaf parents, which of course, this creates quite a conundrum when it comes to language development. So we know that language development is crucial, and we know that the most important time window for learning language is from birth to 3 to 4 years old. Why? Because this is a time when the brain has what's called brain plasticity. So it's very flexible. It's able to rapidly develop language. Unfortunately, if this window is missed, if adequate language is not provided, it can cause a lot of underdeveloped areas: literacy, memory, numbers. And the longer that language development is delayed, the lower the level of ultimate attainment. So if you think about in a visual way, it's almost like the longer I wait, the less I'll be able to use. So it's like the level of language usage gets very narrow. We also know that without a strong L1, it impacts neurological development, behavioral, mental health, and language disfluency, which language disfluency is when someone is communicating with you and everything seems like typical language, but then you realize there's a lot of repetition. We're kind of doing circles in what we're talking about, the inability to move into other topics. We also know there's difficulty understanding how time works, cause and effect, theory of mind, and many other things. There's also an estimate that 70% of deaf children are impacted by language deprivation. Some more facts. We also know that Black deaf children are less likely to not have access to sign language at a young age. Families with deaf children tend to report poor health status, single mother households, and live below the poverty line. Research has also shown us that there's limited access to early intervention in certain homes. For example, families in a rural area, Hispanic families that do not have English fluency who live in rural areas, and Black families in urban areas. And this lack of access to early intervention, that can be the one area that limits a parent from understanding what is available for their children or what would be most beneficial for their children. And of course, we know language deprivation, it really goes back to identification and early services. Oftentimes, poorer academic achievement is sometimes viewed that deaf people, because they are deaf, are not able to have the same achievement as hearing people. However, That is not the case. We know that deaf individuals are capable of the exact same outcomes as hearing people. Unfortunately, parents don't have access to that information. Most people who deal with parents at the very beginning when their child is first diagnosed are not familiar with deaf culture. So in an informal survey of caregivers in Washington, D.C., I asked if doctors had provided a time to discuss what language deprivation was. Overwhelmingly, the answer is no. So of the 12 families, 10 said no. One said not exactly, but they did talk about visual language. But only one family out of 12 families did the doctor tell them about language deprivation. These are some quotes from parents in the survey, which I found to be the most powerful. Parents feeling outraged by not being given information. Parents who later recognize that that language is the most important thing for their children so that they are able to connect with their community. And parents who have to seek their own information. No one told them what they should look for. So as students are getting older, they're entering into school, and we know statistically 88% of deaf children are in regular public schools. The numbers for students in other settings drop significantly, 8.5% being in a separate school for students with disabilities, which that term itself is a little blurry. What kind of school is this? Do they have individuals that are trained to work with deaf children, or have they been put into a program that focuses more on special ed? With a small number of students, 1.5% going to residential schools for the deaf. So of these 88% of deaf children in the United States that go to public school, these are the numbers of different demographics of students who are in attendance. So what we can see here, I combined all of the demographics that are not in a white family. There's 57.5% of our students who come from varying backgrounds that are not white. And this is relevant because later we're going to discuss statistics for how many teachers are white. And I will give you a foreshadowing that I'm sure will not surprise you. There are a much higher rate of white teachers and administrators that does not correlate to the number of students that we're actually, the percentages of the students that we're actually teaching. So given what we just saw, thinking again, why is it important to recognize the positionality of students in your classroom? So when we think about all of the students that we're serving, it's important that we consider intersectionality theory. So intersectionality theory by Kimberly Crenshaw states that when you have overlapping oppressions, you can have compounded impact, which is not recognized by the majority group. And we will discuss more. Dr. Lisa Stapleton said that there exists a dual discrimination and institutional oppression against deaf students who are from marginalized communities. And to help kind of clarify what that means, we again have this handy picture that shows powerful positionalities and marginalized positionalities. So students who are deaf are not in what would be considered the powerful identity of able-bodied, instead would be disabled, which moves further away from the power center. And what she's saying is that if a deaf student is also from a marginalized community, and she's speaking to race being key. If the student is from a non-white family, that takes them away from the power as well. So what is happening is there's actually oppression from society against not only a person who has a disability, but also a person against their race at the same time. So this is what Kimberly Crenshaw is talking about with intersectionality, is that all of your identities together can cause multiple oppressions at the same time. So we're going to look at 3 specific impacts of language deprivation: education, work, and emotion. So the first is educational impact. This is what a lot of us who work in school settings, we see this very often. So none of this is surprising. So language deprivation, they have not received enough language input to be ready for school, to be able to apply all the things they're being taught. They don't have the cognitive capabilities because they have not had access to language. And once again, it impacts their language fluency, their ability to master reading and writing, think critically, use executive functioning. There's also research that shows that the average reading level, the achievement level for reading for deaf adults, can vary. So it says the average for white adults was an 8th grade reading level. The average for Black deaf adults was a 4th grade reading level. And that should give everybody pause. What is happening? Why would one group of students of one race have an average of an 8th grade reading level when another group of students who are the exact same, except from a different race, have a 4th grade reading level? And we know it has nothing to do with biology. So I hope that you will continue to think about intersectional theory as we go through these slides. There is also a discrepancy. Black deaf individuals are graduating with higher rates of certificates from high school in comparison to white deaf adults graduating with diplomas. So these are some statistics from the National Deaf Center. And basically what they are doing, we're looking at a comparison first of hearing and deaf people. So educational attainment. Throughout the entire graph, we can see that hearing people are having higher educational achievement at all levels, regardless of where on their educational journey they are. So now here, they're adding in another identity. So before, we were just looking at hearing and deaf, and now we're comparing white hearing, white deaf, Black hearing, Black deaf, to get a better understanding of how intersectionality is impacting these outcomes. So you can see in these groups that the highest achieving are white hearing people. The lowest levels of achievement are from Black deaf people. But between these two, you can see that white deaf and Black hearing, you see a way that they all correlate together. So white hearing has the highest, then Black hearing, then white deaf, then Black deaf. And so again, you have to question, how does intersectionality theory play into these achievement levels? And for that reason, I have this slide as a reminder, so that as you're going through, don't forget that there are causes for why these things happen. So I want you to continue to consider how intersectionality plays a role. So now we'll look at the vocational impact. So employment disparities, how educational achievement ties to employment rates, and disparities in earnings. So if you take a moment to look at this, again, we're comparing the 4 different positionalities that we considered a couple slides ago and looking at employment rates. When you look at it, you actually see a lot of correlation from the prior slide. White hearing people have the highest rate of employment and the lowest rate of employment to Black deaf individuals. However, Black hearing individuals had a much higher rate of employment, but it didn't quite reach the level of white hearing individuals. So once again, there's a lot of intersectionality at play in what we're seeing, the impact of how society treats race and ability. So once again, we're going to see a comparison between Black deaf hearing people in green and, I'm sorry, Black hearing people in green and Black deaf people in blue. So within a group of Black statistics, you can see that there's a similar correlation with a similar disparity. By having the additional identity of being a deaf person, do you see the difference between the two lines? Unfortunately, I didn't have the research available to correlate with white hearing people and white deaf people into this one because that's not how they created the statistics for this exact topic. But again, intersectionality. So this slide is the one that I find to be the most powerful because now we're seeing it actually how it applies to median earnings. And of course, this is in 2019. But just take a moment and look through, and what do you notice? In this segment, it is not only looking at race and ability, but now they have also added another identity. So now gender has arrived. So now we're looking at 3 different factors and how it impacts employment rates and what the median earnings are. I hope that you'll look through these, but the 2 that I really wanted to show in stark contrast to each other is the comparison of white hearing men, which you can see there is a median earning of $58,000 per year. And then the next one I'd like you to look at is Black deaf women, $33,000 per year. It's a white hearing man on average makes almost twice what a Black deaf woman makes. Switching interpreters. All right, so now I just encourage everyone with what we just covered to just continue holding intersectionality in mind. Okay, so we looked at educational impact, vocational impact, and now we're going to look at emotional impact. So in therapeutic settings, it's very important that an individual is able to use critical thinking and have strong language production. Unfortunately, language deprivation can cause struggles with not only identifying what emotion you're feeling, but how to regulate that emotion and how to discuss that emotion. In therapeutic settings, it's so important to have language fluency, but it's been noted by researchers that there's often characteristics of linguistics deficits, meaning that it's been proposed that individuals with language deprivation could actually require a deaf interpreter or a certified deaf interpreter to be in the room during therapy. And for those of you who may not know, the difficulty required in obtaining an ASL interpreter, it is so difficult to convince the office to hire an interpreter, but then to also tell them that they need 2. You need a hearing ASL interpreter and you're going to need a deaf interpreter. So the burden is really on the patient who is already struggling with language deprivation. It's also been found that clinicians see language deprivation commonly as one of the symptoms in deaf individuals that are seeking treatment. Some other emotional impacts: one, depression. Someone's own identification, perception of their language abilities can cause depression if they see that others are able to communicate in a more fluid way. Why can't I communicate like that? Also, struggling to communicate at home. If the whole home family, caregivers, friends, if everyone is speaking and one individual needs sign language and they don't have access to communication, this can lead to strong feelings of depression. There's also one that was new to me that I recently learned about: interpersonal trauma. Growing up as a deaf child in a hearing world can actually create long-term trauma. And research shows that there's an elevated proportion of mental health concerns in the deaf community. I think there would be a strong argument to say that language deprivation is one of the causes of this. All right, you can pause as you think about these questions and how they apply to your own practices. So we know what language deprivation is. And on this slide, I call it LDS because the medical community calls it the language deprivation syndrome. Unfortunately, in education, this doesn't seem to be considered as important as the mental health field does. So huge thanks to that community for trying to bring this to the center of conversation. So how does language deprivation impact a kindergartner? So this is one of my students, Mr. L. He was in preschool and then moved up into kindergarten with us. But unfortunately, in preschool, his teacher did not sign with him very often. He exhibited a number of different behaviors that caused him to be disruptive to his own learning, as well as to the learning of the other students in the class. So what I learned after he joined our class was that he often was put in the corner and he would just be left to do whatever he wanted to do with one paraprofessional. So when he arrived at kindergarten into our program, he started out with very little linguistically and knowledge-based information. He spent most of the day, for almost the first year that he was with us, laying on the floor, refusing to get on or off the bus, hitting things, kicking things, biting things, generally just refusing to do any work at all. So this was a very common occurrence, and this is what my room often looked like, was me sitting on the floor with just a tiny little bit of work to do and a timer. Like, if you need to be under the table, that's okay. Here's some time, and then we can do this. But he was very, very unenthusiastic about coming to the classroom. So what do we do when we have students that come to our rooms, and how do we teach them when they have so little language foundation? So this brings us to part 2, instruction strategies. So as we start this section, it's important to be mindful of the fact that language deprivation is almost on a spectrum. It could be a lighter version where there are knowledge gaps. It could be very severe where the student really has not had access to any language and has very limited knowledge about the world. And that's what makes providing a presentation about approaches difficult, because every child is so unique and language deprivation will challenge each child in their own individual way. Okay, so first tip, classrooms should be memorable, practical, and repetitious. Why? Well, because of the brain. So the way that the brain learns, and I'm not a medical doctor, I'm not a brain scientist, but just from things that I have read, it makes a lot of sense why it's so difficult to learn after experiencing language deprivation. So memory and learning take place in the hippocampus. So basically what happens is every day, all of us see and hear and smell and taste and feel thousands and thousands and thousands of stimuli. If the brain was really going to pay attention to every single thing in the environment, it would be impossible. So what the brain's job is to do is to take in all of the things around us, and it has to filter out what actually might be important here. And so it will put it into your short-term memory, which means that, the brain is interested. This might be important. I'm going to keep it just for a brief time. And so we also know for children who have typically developed brain networking that you have 12 to 15 minutes of active input time. After that, the brain is no longer interested. It is burnt out. It needs a break. And so after that 12 to 15 minutes, the brain requires a 10-minute cycle down. Now, a cycle down doesn't mean that everyone goes and takes a nap. Instead, it means instead of lecturing for 40 minutes, you teach for a little bit, then you have an activity that applies so that students don't have to continue looking and listening. Instead, they can actually start doing something with their hands or doing a fun game, something that's still using the information, but they have to take a break. So back to the hippocampus. So you have that short-term memory that's being held in the brain. So next, what's going to happen is that the brain is going to move it into your working memory, which is called elaboration. But it is only going to do that if that short-term memory has proven to be important. Is this relevant? Does it actually apply to anything? This is the importance of making sure that we use the backgrounds of our students when we're teaching. What is important to them? What is of interest to them? What kinds of activities can we incorporate that they will find interesting, that the brain will say, this short-term memory is actually pretty cool. I might need this for later. So it's going to move it into your working memory. So for example, this is a video of me doing the ABC song. So basically, when hearing children are learning the ABCs, there's a nice little tune that goes with it, and we all learn it really based on the sound of that music. It helps us remember what goes next. So in our room, we have a visual ABC song that helps students remember the order by the pattern in which they are on your body. So this is simply ABCs put in different locations that students can memorize. I filmed that during COVID, if you couldn't tell. But so this has really helped a lot with our students. I don't believe that knowing ABC order is the most pivotal thing that a child must learn in school, but at some grades that is part of the standards. And we have found it to be very helpful to put it to a movement, a repetition, since sometimes sound-based, that's not motivating. That doesn't help with memorizing, but having things on the body, physical repetition can help. Or in this next video that I'll show a short clip from, this is a social studies lesson learning about the different regions in the state of Virginia. So the student does have access to sound and music. However, memory was difficult. So in order to learn regions, they used music and they did not use ASL. They actually used dance moves to show the different formations of the regions.
They part of the Appalachian Mountains, Blue Ridge Mountains are part of the Appalachian Mountains. Valley and Ridge are valleys along the Blue Ridge Mountains. Okay. Valley and Ridge are valleys along the Blue Ridge Mountains.
So having simple, physical, repetitious movements learned our regions. So make sure I'm on the right slide. Okay. So another fun fact is that it's important to remember that after 20 minutes, you only remember 60% of what you just learned. If it's been 24 hours since you've been exposed to that information, you only remember 30% of what you learned. Now consider students that have language deprivation. If the brain is already struggling to figure out where to put information, my assumption as a non-scientist would be that they would remember less than children who already had full neural pathways established. So there is one bright side. So if you practice within 24 hours, you're able to remember 80% of what you learned. Now, again, I use these numbers with caution because with children that have language deprivation, it's likely not going to be that high of a percentage. But we do know that repetition and practice is what encourages children to remember more. So while teachers may feel that they have taught the same thing for a month, if the student doesn't know it yet, they don't know it yet. And so that's our responsibility to figure out, how can I reshape this lesson? How could I make it more interesting? Do I need to find a way to make it more hands-on? Do I need to find a way to make it more visual? What do I need to do? So I'm constantly, as a teacher, constantly evaluating what I could do differently, because it's not the student's burden to figure out how they learn. It's our burden to figure out how they learn. So the last part of memory and learning, so we had short-term working memory, and now we're on to the final stage, which is long-term memory. So this is the goal. In order to move it from working memory to long-term memory, you actually have to provide that child with real-world applications, projects that require real creation. The brain of the student needs to know that what they're learning is something that they're going to need through the rest of their life. These are, I'm sure there's a lot of things from school that we do not remember. And, that's okay. But for students to really grasp the concepts we're teaching them, they have to have a reason. Otherwise, the brain has no reason to keep it, which is why I don't remember a lot from what I learned in school, because I hate math and science, and I'm sorry. But those parts were hard for me in school. So I think my brain felt traumatized, so I just scooted those out of the way. So after teaching, you have 1 to 2 days to revisit in order to move them into the long-term memory. So there's not a lot of time. If you're thinking that you want to teach clocks for 2 days in September and then we'll come back to it the last week of September, and then in October, we'll touch again. That might not be the best plan, given that we know that we need immediate repetition. And something that's really cool, there's something called myelin. So inside the brain, you have neurons that are firing signals to other neurons. As a student is working on the same skill and practicing repetition, it causes the neurons to develop myelin, which is actually a fatty protein substance that goes right on top of the neuron. And what's really cool about that is that when it has the myelin, the neuron can now fire faster because the student or the person has mastered the skill that the neuron no longer has to really think about it. It just does it. And that's actually what leads our students to being able to do higher level processing. So remember how hard it was when you were teaching them the alphabet? Just the capitals and then add the lowercase, and then they learned how to write it, and now they're writing words. It's because their brain is creating myelin. So now those tasks that were very difficult at the beginning, identifying the ABCs, are no longer difficult. The brain has mastered those practices. Isn't that cool? All right, so take a moment and consider these questions and how they fit your classroom. Okay, so you're getting ready to build your classroom environment. Things to consider. Make sure you're very clear with expectations and have guidelines that include visuals. So I'm sure many of you have something like this. These are our classroom rules, but every rule has an adjoining photo. So that way every student can look and see clearly what the expectations are. Simple tools that we'll put in students' binders depending on need. Some students need reminders of the 4 zones of regulation, which are these colored little characters here. Other students, for example, my friend, Mr. L, he might need a visual comparison. What do I do? What am I not doing? Or perhaps you need to create a preference assessment. You need to have whatever their choices are on a board. That way they know what they're working toward. For some students, they may need a visual schedule, which could be more complicated, like the one on the left, where it actually has the words of where I'm going, the picture of what I'm doing, and the times included. Or perhaps like Mr. L, instead you need a much more hands-on, visual, clear expectations of what the day is going to look like. So the beauty of the My Schedule with staff photos is that if a student doesn't care for one staff member, they can be prepared for that. They know when they're going to be switching to work with each staff member. So this allows them to have control over their day. Yes, I don't like it, but I know when it's coming. Or say they don't like math, it's still going to be on the schedule, but you know where it's going to be, you know who it's going to be with, and when you finish it, you get to move it to the done column. So having something like this actually created a lot of motivation for our student because he would see the thing he didn't want to do. And then he knew as soon as he got it done, it was done. I would not pressure him after that. It was done. So, oh, interpreter switch. Okay. So this is an example. I did not make this. You can see at the bottom, it says Cindy Dean. That is not me. I think my co-teacher got this on Teachers Pay Teachers. But we use this visual when we have new bus drivers. So we will deliver one of these to the bus driver so that they have a visual to show the student. We will also explain this visual in the classroom to the students. Another thing we give to bus drivers are very simple sign language laminated pages that have simple signs like sit or seat belt. Okay, so now we're going to see this short video where basically what I'm doing is describing to my student the behavior that I would like to see and the behavior that I would rather not see. And so we're using a token system. So I will voice for myself in this video. So if you bite or if you kick, that's going to be an X for Monday. If your behavior is great, if you're sharing, smiling, behaving nicely, interacting nicely, asking for what you want or need, well, then you're going to get a check on Monday. And look at this. So this student had already had this described to him, what this process would look like. And he knew that the green box meant that he was going to get an award, or a reward. There would be something that he is getting for using appropriate hands, keeping our hands to ourselves and doing our best to use communication. So what we would do with that video is he had a student iPad. So as he moved around the school with different staff members, he could be reminded of what the expectations were. So this is Mr. L on the very first week that he managed to get checks for every day's expected behavior. And so at the end, he got his reward, which was a full page of stickers, and he got a certificate for, quote, being nice to friends. And he was so shocked that he actually did it. Like, I think he was so surprised in his own capability because for so long that had been his only channel for frustration and his only channel to express himself. But as he did continue to develop language, he had less physical outbursts and instead was able to say that he didn't like something or he didn't want something. So this is a video of the moment that I gave him the certificate. It's a little bit blurry, but gets me every time. So you can see when he first is like, we recognize, hey, you did this. His immediate reaction was to start crying. And mine too. But so when he got that, and when he runs away and he's showing another student in the school, like, look what I got, that feeling of accomplishment. And the paraprofessional that's in the foreground, you can see her kneeling on the ground. The two of them had such a great connection to see how they had that exchange back and forth, like just demonstrating that pride and accomplishment. Told you it gets me every time. So a thought for you, what visuals could you add to your classroom? Okay, so thinking about the materials that we use in our class during instruction, paper, video resources, PowerPoints, etc. So I'm sure most of you have something that's very similar to this. This is also a teacher pay teacher's accoutrement to the calendar. So basically I took everything that they offered in the calendar set, cut it out, laminated it, but then I made it a part of everything that we do with morning calendar routines. So it's got all the seasons right there, all the days of the week, the signs for what a day, a week, a month. It's got the abbreviations for all of the months it's right next to the calendar, both of these posters. But as soon as I started making my calendar setup this visual, I saw immediate change in how students interacted with it. Instead of it just being treated like a counting exercise, what day goes after Tuesday? Well, there's a 3, so it's a 4. Instead of it being like that, it became this much more immersive, like almost fun. Where's Waldo? Like they're looking for all of the right symbols on the board. Like where are all the matching signs? And I found that the students were actually much more motivated to do the calendar. So these are simple products that were created to support students learning different skills. On the left, this is something that I brainstormed thinking of a student who had language deprivation, whose English vocabulary was not very strong, but he did have a really good instinct for math. However, this concept really was throwing him to borrow 10. I know it's not called borrowing. My math coach always yells at me about it, but you know what I mean. So what we ended up doing, I was just using the only words that he had in his sight words as like a little emphasis, because he knows little, big, can't, can. So this became a visual that he had available at his desk as a reminder of when he could borrow and when he could not. The one next to it is a science handout that was given to students so that they could understand that the sun not only provides light, but heat, and how in different circumstances, certain things happen because of one of these. So without having to have fluent language, they would be able to interact with this activity and demonstrate their own knowledge rather than their ability to read. So here are just some additional visuals. So looking at things that describe what the weather is, different temperatures, as well as visuals to support WH word learning. This was a visual that we created when we were teaching the beginning, middle, and end of a story. We used the idea of a train because, pretty much all children have seen different books or images that have a train, and generally, the one that's got the little smokestack on it, that's going to be the first car and then subsequent cars. So we had the students put themselves on the train doing the signs for the beginning, the middle, the end. Here are more visuals for WH, and I think the reason why there are so many is because I have realized the longer I teach elementary school, just how difficult it is to learn the WH concepts. And then next to that, we have examples of the 4 zones of regulation. Actually, one of those zones is missing. 3 of the 4 zones are here, along with etiquette signs. Just reminders in the classroom of how they can communicate feelings. This is a reminder that we put on student desks. So it's something that's taped onto the surface. So no matter what time it is, what we're working on, they always have exposure to these concepts. And look, more WH stuff. So again, this has been such a tough concept for students to understand. So this is kind of like a game that we created where you have different categories of words. And so you can do this many different ways. You could guide the student through understanding where they go. You can mix them up and have the student place them in their own categories. One thing that was tricky is determining, would an animal go into the what or the who? And so since I teach elementary school, many of the characters in our books are animals. So that's why there is a mouse under the who category. But of course, that's a later conversation as you start talking about nouns. Is it a person, a place, or a thing? Okay, well, now you can start shifting the mouse to the other category. This is an example of how to teach a higher level subject that a student might not linguistically or be able to read this material, but they can understand the most basic concepts of it. So our standard, I believe this is fourth grade, is to teach the three branches of the United States government. So what I did was I found this visual on the left that was very clear. I was very surprised and pleased by how clear it was. For example, under legislative, all of those icons, they've got similarities. They're all buildings. Under executive, it's all people. Under judicial, they all have the balance scale. So this simplicity and consistency they used with icons actually made it a wonderful tool for teaching because they could understand legislative, it's where they meet in buildings. Executive, people that do things. I'm not actually teaching you, so I can be a little fuzzy. And then judicial, right or wrong, win or lose. So then after we taught this information, then we could give them an assignment, which is on the right, where basically all I did was take the image on the left and cut out pieces of it, mix them up, and then the student has to cut them out and paste them under the correct on the correct column. But because it's directly from what I taught them, they're learning how to complete an assignment. So it's not so much that I want them to understand every single aspect of the legislative branch, but they're getting exposure to the content and they're also learning how to sort things according to the category. They're learning independence too, which is a huge one. A student with severe language deprivation wouldn't need very much help for this. So think of that huge feeling of achievement, like, hey, I did that all by myself and look at all the words on this page. I still did it. So creating assignments that match what you're teaching, especially for students who are still pretty far behind in comparison to typical peers, this can be very helpful, not just for learning, but for self-esteem, which without self-esteem, there will not be very much learning. So when you think about building PowerPoints, so again, this is fourth grade or fifth grade standards. We're talking about American Revolution. What in the world is the United Kingdom, France, and Spain? Or England, I'm sorry. So a lot of our students, we have to teach them these concepts, but like, what is a continent? What is a country? What is a king? What is a queen? So making it as visual as possible. And when I would present this, I have the globe in my arms so we can spin and see where all of these different places are in relation to where I'm telling them we are. There's a lot of trust involved in learning. So what I did was I had, based on where they are geographically on the map from north to south is how I place their names and how I place their flags across from the name. So if a student is struggling to be able to retain that England is England, instead, perhaps the look of their flag will stick. So throughout the rest of the PowerPoint, the flags are used every time the country is used. So for example, here we have a comparison, I'm sorry, we have a juxtaposition, I guess. We have the British side and we have the French side talking about the French and Indian War. Who fought in that war? Well, I don't actually have to put too many details on the slide because it's got so many great visuals. And based on the prior slide, we've already talked about those flags. So if there's any confusion, I can just bounce back and point these two countries right next to each other. Or for example, if you're teaching about the American Revolution and you have to go deep into all of these taxes, well, it all depends on what they're ready for. Exposure to content is great. Providing information that causes the student to just become exhausted and not learn, maybe not so great. So you can see here, we've got the name of the king, a picture of the king, and the flag of where he is from, as well as visuals to help provide reminders for what these different acts meant. And I will tell you that the best activity that we ever did in social studies, we were learning about taxes and the students were like, I don't get it. So I put real coins on each of their desks, like a little pile of coins. And they were all excited because, they're not jaded. They were excited. So put all the coins out, and then I nodded at one of the paraprofessionals who was waiting outside the classroom. She had put on a little crown, and when I nodded at her, she came in and she walked to each student's desk and she scooped almost all of the money off their desk. She would only leave 1 or 2 coins. And when she finished collecting them all, she left the room, and all of the students' jaws were on the floor. They were upset, like, they took my money. What is this? And I was just like, taxes. You had to give your money to the king. And I'll tell you, none of those students have forgotten what taxes are. This is another example of using, okay, make sure I'm on the right one. So this is actually my co-teacher. Her name is Gil. She's great. So what she's doing here is in class, she's been teaching a social studies lesson on the rivers in the state of Virginia. And that's a really dry topic. There's not a lot of practicality to it. We're not in a helicopter. I can't just like show you each river. So Gil went on a fun Saturday afternoon, and it ended up that she was on, I believe, the Potomac River. And so she took that brief opportunity to film herself out the river and give the kids a little background. So she's saying we have the 4 rivers, the Potomac, the Rappahannock, the Yorktown, and the James. Look, which one is this? I wonder. Ah ha ha, it's the Potomac. So it was a real life application moment. It's like, not only did my teacher tell me about rivers, but I actually saw my teacher at the river, so I know it's real. Gil is very amazing and very talented. So these are little cards that she made for our students for each unit that they accomplished. So you can see there's a planet, Virginia regions, the rivers, working with a recipe, understanding day and night. And so what she did with these was she created these fun little cards that were like collector items. So kids were really excited to start learning a new topic because they knew at the end of the topic, they were going to get a new collector card. So this was a great way not only to provide motivation for students, but also they all have reminders on them. Like every single picture is so perfect to remind students of what that important content was. And here's just a simple thing that we've put up in the science classroom so that students can have quick reminders when they're doing assignments. They can't remember the spelling of words, or they can't remember the concepts behind certain words. Switch interpreters. All right. So this is another science visual that we have in the classroom. One of our paraprofessionals actually took this upon herself. She noticed that students were struggling with this concept of rotation and revolutions. So she put this together to help students have more clarity, which is wonderful. And if you have paraprofessionals in your classroom, I encourage you to interact with them and ask them what they like, what they don't like, find out what their strengths are, because a lot of times paraprofessionals are underutilized and can really become such a strong member of your team if you create them the opportunity to do so. So these are just some more visuals. Math visuals, the one on the left is working with patterns, just creating very simple line guidelines for students to see where what is called the core of the pattern, where is the core and then the subsequent patterns that stem from it. Or here on the right side is just me doing a very sloppy, quick reminder of what the hour and the minute hand look like, and how the hour hand, it's going to go very little distance in the same amount of time that the minute hand will go all the way around. Also with math, we kind of already talked about the one on the left, but the one on the right is talking about number patterns. So some of our students had a hard time recognizing, like, what am I supposed to do? You gave me 3 random numbers. Now what? How do I know? I don't know the pattern. So right underneath that is a box that has first on the left the plus and minus sign, and then on the other side just has a blank line. So basically what the student learns to do is look at we're going from 2 to 5. Is it getting bigger or smaller? So here it's getting bigger. So I would circle plus. And then the next one is, okay, from 2 to 5, how much bigger? So if I'm at 2, 3, 3, 4, 5, I would put a 3 there. And then I would know that in the subsequent blanks, I need to add 3 each time. All right, so you can take a moment and review these application questions. Okay, so now looking at scaffolding, making sure assignments are at an appropriate level. So in our program, we have separate reading classrooms. So we'll break into groups depending on what the student's reading level is. And they'll use different levels of materials. So we don't always have the same students reading the same material. It's all based on their levels. And some students will work one-on-one with a staff, where other students can work together with one staff. So this is one instance where we did have a group of students working on the same book, where the students were at different different ability levels. So the object of this is to put the story in chronological order, beginning, middle, and end. One of our students had difficulty creating pictures that were visual enough to understand what had been drawn. So for that student, we would have pre-printed pictures from the book, because we couldn't tell if the student understood the story because we couldn't identify what was happening in the picture that she would draw. So she was provided with actual visuals from the book, whereas the student on the right, he was able to create drawings that we could understand. So rather than have him try to write words out because he didn't know any at the time, he would just draw us pictures. So far we've got pasted on pre-printed pictures. We've got drawn pictures. We have another level on the left of drawn pictures, but you'll notice that none of these people have torsos. They have the stick figure bodies. But I'm very happy to report that when that student started with us, every person that he would draw was just a head, and it would have arms coming out of its head and legs coming out of its head. So look at that. They have torsos, and that's a huge gain for a child that never learned how to read or write or draw. Huge gains. I think he was around 7 years old at the time. So if you look at the right, we see a completely different level of a response to the same reading. So there was the glue on, there was the draw, and now this student is creating short sentences to describe the beginning, middle, and end, in addition to drawing pictures, which I'm biased, but this girl is a natural artist. Then looking at different examples of things that we use, you can see we move into labeling for students who they're not yet ready to write an actual sentence, but they can start doing some labeling of the keywords that are found in the text. Or on the next page, I'm sorry, on the right side, this is my version of a graphic organizer. This is one that I had made. I had it drawn out to my specifics. So that students can put all of those different pieces of a story map together. Then this is another level. This is actually the student who drew the torso, the lined figure that just had the lined torso. This was him a couple years later. Now he was at the point where he could actually state what he wanted his sentence to be, and the teacher would use highlighter to help him keep track of his sentences. How many words did you say? Okay. And then for some of this, he would have to look back at the book to find spellings, but he has audio access, so he was doing his best to use phonetic encoding. And these are just some more examples of how the work becomes more difficult over time, but these are all the same children. This student is one who has a fair amount of audio access, who has a more light version of language deprivation. However, she is from a Spanish-speaking home, speaks English at school, and signs in both locations. So often what we see with her is that she speaks verbally in sign language, and she writes a lot of her responses in sign language in a gloss. So it's difficult for her to create these, even though she does have audio access, but because she's juggling 3 languages at the same time, these assignments are very difficult for her. All right, and you can just take a moment to think about differentiated assignments in your room. And then lastly, this is a scenario that I would encourage you to think about when you have a deaf education classroom with students on varying levels of language fluency, but then your expectation from administration is that you're going to focus on a grade level content area that you know that the students likely are not ready for. How would you differentiate to do all of the things that the student is supposed to know? So I encourage you to use what we've talked about and think, how would you break it down? What would be your high expectation for the student that's also reasonable? What examples could you provide? And how could you assess them to know if they really understand persuasion? If they're not ready for a multi-paragraph composition, what would be appropriate and how would you teach to that? I think sometimes we get overwhelmed because the standard is it's seemingly impossible. But if we think backwards, step by step, what would be the thing they needed to know right before this? A 1 paragraph? Maybe before that is 1 statement. Before that, it's understanding an opinion. Before that, discussing things you like and don't like. Thank you.